And welcome back, everyone, to Era 4 of the APUS history, covering years 1800 to 1848. In this video, we're going to be looking at topic 4.4, which looks at America on the world stage. The theme this time is America in the world, and is specifically the diplomatic, economic, cultural, and military interactions between empires, nations, and peoples, and how that shapes the development of America, as well as America's increasingly important role in the world. And we're going to have a war in this one, so it's going to be a bit long, so let's get to it. Even though the U.S. had signed Jay's treaty with Britain, the practice of impressment had never really come to an end. Technically, the treaty only promised compensation for past seizure of ships and men and made no promise against future seizures. Well, as the war between Britain and France continued, the British Navy once again began to violate American independence and neutrality by seizing ships that were bound for French ports. And once again, they would press members of the crews into the service of the British Navy, which was desperate for men. It caused much complaining amongst Americans, but many merchants, especially those in New England, saw it mostly as just an inconvenience. There were some demands for war, but as the French were also seizing ships, although they weren't impressing the crews, there was some debate as to which side the Americans should choose. Then in 1807, the British warship, the Leopard, attacked the Chesapeake. And it wasn't an attack on a merchant ship. This was an attack on a U.S. warship. And just off the coast of Norfolk, Virginia, too. The British ship claimed to be looking for deserters, who were believed to be amongst the Chesapeake's crew, and they seized 4 men. 4 others were killed, and more than a dozen were wounded in the fighting. America was outraged over the British actions, and the demand for war increased. Jefferson, though, first resorted to economic pressure because he really didn't believe the U.S. could truly challenge Britain. Plus, America was Britain's biggest trading partner, and he doesn't totally want to disrupt that. But his attempt at economic pressure, it's the Embargo Act of 1807, and according to the law, no American ship could sail into any foreign port. So not only would U.S. not deliver goods to Britain or France, those countries wouldn't be able to get American goods by sailing to some other European port, which was the idea behind cutting off all trade. The idea was that, Britain was America's biggest trading partner, and America was Britain's biggest trading partner, so the idea was that they would be hurt so much financially that they would have to concede to America's wishes. Unfortunately, the plan backfired because Britain had no trouble finding new suppliers, and the Americans couldn't sell to anybody else unless those people came here, and most of them didn't. The U.S. economy was sent into a severe depression, with the New England merchants and the shipbuilders that depended on overseas trade hurt the worst. Because of the severe financial impact, the act would be repealed early in 1809, literally the final days of President Jefferson's time in office. But the problem still wasn't over, so Congress passed a new law in 1809 called the Non-Intercourse Act that allowed the resumption of American trade with all nations except Britain and France. But even with some trade restored, the American economy continued to suffer. So the following year, Congress passed Makin's Bill No. 2, which would resume normal trade between the U.S. and with both Britain and France. But in it, there was a provision that if either of those two countries agreed to formally respect U.S. neutral rights at sea, then the U.S. would immediately reinstate the embargo against the other one. Upon being informed of the passage of this law, Napoleon Bonaparte immediately announced that he intended to do exactly as the law required. So the U.S., following through, did the embargo against Britain. However, Napoleon was never actually going to have his ministry pass any such resolution that would respect American rights at sea, and French ships continued to attack American shipping that was headed anywhere close to Britain. And America didn't realize the deception by Napoleon right away, because obviously it's going to take time for the ships that were out at sea to be informed of this new policy. And by the time the Americans realized the deception, we'd already declared war on Britain. Now, the U.S. had long believed the British were supplying Native Americans on the frontier with weapons so that those natives could attack Americans trying to expand westward. And even with Jay's treaty in place, trade was still possible for the Native Americans to the British via the Great Lakes towards Canada. New attacks on the frontier added to this growing concern. And then the Americans discovered that there was an attempt by the tribes in the Northwest Territories to form a confederacy, a unification of many different tribes for the purpose of resisting American westward expansion. This Indian confederacy would be led by a pair of Shawnee brothers, Tecumseh, who was a war leader, and Tenskwatawa, otherwise known as the Prophet, who was a religious leader. Their goal was to unite the tribes east of the Mississippi River to protect native lands. General William Henry Harrison, the governor of the Indiana Territory, took an army to try and force the Shawnee into making peace in 1811. Instead, native warriors attacked, but Harrison defeated these tribal forces at the Battle of Tippecanoe. Part of the reason for his success had been the superiority of numbers, but also was that Tecumseh, the war leader, wasn't actually present at Tippecanoe. He was instead out attempting to gather more tribes to his cause. Because of this victory, though, Harrison would be hailed as a national hero, and this battle would help propel him into the White House in later years. By 1812, the tensions between the U.S. and Britain had grown too much, and President Madison sought a declaration of war. When it comes down to it, there really is three main causes for why the United States declared war. First, it was the issue of American rights and freedom of the sea, basically the rights of sailors not to be forced into service of another nation, in other words, imprisonment. Britain considered anyone born in British territory to be a citizen, and under their laws there was no way to give up that citizenship. And remember, since they didn't acknowledge U.S. independence until 1783, essentially they viewed anyone born before that, which means anybody over the age of 29, which really wasn't super old. But anyway, they viewed them as a British subject. So they justified their actions, claiming that they were targeting deserters, and often considered anyone who could speak English as being a deserter. A large proportion of the individuals they took were Irishmen, whose country Britain controlled, but Irishmen had virtually no rights under British law. Interestingly, the British didn't consider anyone who was black to be a citizen, but they still sometimes pressed black sailors into service. A second cause was the continued issues on the frontier involving Native Americans and resisting westward expansion, as I just mentioned on the last slide. There wasn't a lot of evidence that the British were actively helping them, but land-hungry Americans really didn't care about evidence. Rumors were enough. And, there were certainly attacks on frontier settlements, plus that whole Indian Confederacy under Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, so that was enough. And the third reason was the influence of a young generation of congressmen, nicknamed the Warhawks, who were particularly interested in expansion. Most of them were in the House of Representatives, and most of them were from the frontier states, or the southern states, and their goal was to gain additional land for settlement. Not only did they want to move out the Native Americans, some of them even had a desire to claim at least a portion of Canada and incorporate that into the United States, perhaps succeeding where their fathers had failed way back in the Revolution. Although there's no set list as to who exactly a Warhawk was, like all of the different members. There even seemed to be some that kind of came and went. But it's generally agreed on that the two most prominent Warhawks were Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. Now, when it came to the war itself, the U.S. was totally unprepared. Even when we declared it in June of 1812, we had a whopping 16 warships with about 7,200 men and Marines. But only 2 warships on the entire Great Lakes, and there are 5 Great Lakes. But individuals we did have in our military were poorly trained, poorly equipped, and poorly led, which made them mostly useless. Plus, with the nation divided about whether or not they should even go to war, the Federalist-dominated New England was generally opposed because it would disrupt trade, and that was their livelihood. Both in the sense that Britain obviously is not going to trade with an enemy, plus, their port cities were susceptible to a blockade. Meaning it's going to be difficult to recruit enough troops from those areas. Also remember that the U.S. was going to war against the most powerful maritime nation in the world, and the American Navy was tiny in comparison. For the U.S. to stand a chance, they really needed to keep the war as a land-based war, since most of Britain's army was busy fighting in Europe. And if Napoleon kept winning in Europe, the British Army, and even the British Navy, would be kept largely at home to fight those battles in Europe, and to defend itself against a possible French invasion. So the ships that were going to be sent to North America were likely going to be second-rate, which would at least keep things somewhat close. But again, we needed France to keep Britain busy. Now, the U.S. began its attacks on British positions by launching a three-point invasion of Canada, simultaneously attacking from Detroit, in present-day Michigan, from Niagara, in western New York, and from Lake Champlain, which is located in upstate New York, along the eastern side. But these attacks were hampered by poor leadership and the refusal of some militias, especially in New England, to leave their states to assist. A successful attack was on the provincial capital of York, which is present-day Toronto. The Americans forced the British to retreat away from their fort there, but the retreating British set off an explosion, destroying their own magazine to prevent it from falling into American hands. But it was such a powerful explosion, it was heard and felt more than 30 miles away, and killed numerous Americans, who then retaliated by looting and burning the town. The British would retaliate the following year. Another area of success was on the Great Lakes, with the British being forced to retreat from Detroit, the American forces in Ohio, now led by General William Henry Harrison, overtaking the British at the Battle of the Thames River, which proved to be a decisive victory for the Americans, and effectively ended the Indian Confederacy in the north with the death of Tecumseh in the battle in 1813. But by the time 1814 began, Napoleon had abdicated in France, meaning that the war in Europe was over. That meant that the British no longer needed to keep large numbers of troops in Europe and could instead reinforce their numbers in North America. In addition, more of their navy would be available for action, as well as a blockade, which means America's hope to conquer Canada was pretty much over. As for the Naval War, the U.S. actually had a series of victories for both the U.S. Navy and for their privateers. Most of the battles involved just one ship facing off against another, and the success of warships like the Constitution, the United States, the Wasp, and the Hornet were celebrated throughout the country. Still, the Royal Navy controlled the Atlantic, and it was really only through the use of privateers that goods were able to be brought in through the United States through the blockade. The Uss Constitution, mostly pictured here, was a typical ship for the U.S. in this era. She had 44 guns, which was a lot smaller than the largest ships of the line that Britain had. But most of those largest ships were in European waters, so most of the time the American encounters with the British Navy were on a little bit more equal footing, although we still usually were a little bit smaller than they were. In one particular battle involving the Constitution, though, American sailors observed how British cannonballs bounced off the sides of the American ship, exclaiming that the ship must be made of iron. The statement earned the USS Constitution the nickname Old Ironsides. Of course, she wasn't made of iron at all, just very dense old-growth American oak, and the ship is actually still part of the United States Navy, with a full-time crew of officers and enlisted men. But really, it's a tourist attraction. In addition to the fleet on the ocean, though, there was also American warships on the Great Lakes. After the Americans lost control of Detroit, a hastily assembled U.S. fleet on Lake Erie ensured that Americans retained control of the lake itself, which improved American morale. And it caused the British to move back out of Detroit, which meant the Americans could take it back. With the British defeat on Lake Erie and the success of privateers in seizing ships and supplies that were destined to British soldiers, the naval campaigns were actually proving to be a bright spot and a major morale booster for the country as a whole. But there was virtually nothing the Americans could do about the blockade of the major ports. They simply didn't have enough ships, or strong enough ships, to do it. The only possible bright side was the fact that the coast was so large that privateers and smugglers could slip in relatively unnoticed away from the major ports. Now, there was an attempt by the British to invade the U.S. from Canada through upstate New York, but it ultimately failed, causing them to shift their focus to the mid-Atlantic area, and in particular to plan a retaliation for the previous year's looting and burning in New York. In the summer of 1814, the British Navy, ferrying hundreds of troops, arrived in the Chesapeake Bay, landing at various locations in Maryland and seizing supplies and even some slaves in an attempt to disrupt the militia from mounting a defense of the cities of Washington and Baltimore. The U.S. military believed that Baltimore would be the main target, and for the most part it was. But they didn't believe that Washington would be targeted at all, which was a significant mistake because, after all, it is the capital. On August 24th, 1814, an army of more than 2,500 men attacked the city of Washington. They ransacked the president's house, even dining on the food that had been set out for dinner, before setting fire to many of the government buildings. During the attack, Dolly Madison, the president's wife, directed the servants to load as many of the valuables as possible to be taken away from the advancing British. She is actually credited with saving the official portrait of George Washington and the signed original copy of the Declaration of Independence. Not only was the president's palace destroyed, but so was the Capitol, the library, the Treasury, and the Navy Yard, including several ships. All would be rebuilt, although the presidential palace wouldn't get the official nickname of the White House until the 20th century. But being painted white was something they had to do to hide the scorch marks. Well, in the aftermath of the attack on Washington, a major storm blew in, spawning numerous tornadoes, drenching the city, which helped to put out the fires, although it also added to the destruction. Still, it forced the British Army to abandon Washington after just 26 hours of occupation. Some within the city felt that it was God's punishment on the British for their destruction. The British thought otherwise. After leaving Washington, the British sailed back down the Potomac River and up the Chesapeake Bay, rather than going the 40 miles overland because it's actually easier to travel by water. And their target this time was the port city of Baltimore. Now, the port was defended by Fort McHenry to the south. And in an attack that lasted about 25 hours using bombs that were meant to shock and awe the defenders, the fort was bombarded with thousands of pounds of explosives. Despite the heavy bombardment, casualties in the fort were slight, and the British ships eventually realized they simply couldn't get past it to attack Baltimore itself, at least not in coordination with the land invading force that they had dropped off earlier, so they called off their attack, sailed down the bay, and picked up their army, which had retreated from the east side of the city of Baltimore. Throughout the night, the exploding bombs had illuminated an American flag that flew over the fort, and the following morning, that flag was still visible, prompting an American lawyer, Francis Scott Key, to write a poem titled The Defense of Fort McHenry, as he observed the battle from on board a British ship where he was negotiating the release of Americans held prisoner. The large garrison flag that was visible in the dim light of the morning proved that the Americans had resisted the shelling. And as the words of his poem say, "Oh, say can you see by dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight, o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?" In his final stanza he says, "Oh, thus be it ever when free men shall stand between their loved homes and the war's desolation. Blessed with victory and peace, may the heaven-rescued land praise the power that hath made and preserved us a nation. Then conquer we must when our cause it is just, and this be our motto, in God is our trust. And the star-spangled banner in triumph shall wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave." Now, the flag described in the poem still exists today and has a special place of honor in the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. The poem, written by Francis Scott Key, as I said, was actually quickly set to a popular song called Anacreon in Heaven, which was first written and popularized in England by a men's social club there, but it had crossed the Atlantic and also became popular here. It would officially become the U.S. national anthem in 1931. Well, after their defeat at Baltimore, the British shifted their attention to the southern states, which they viewed as especially vulnerable because such a large percentage of all U.S. exports was southern cotton. So they began a blockade of the major port cities there. In addition, you had one faction of the Creek Indians, following the example of Tecumseh in the Northwest Territory, begin attacking U.S. troops in Alabama. Militias under the command of General Andrew Jackson fought back and decisively defeated the Creek at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in March of 1814. And the main portion of the Creek signed a treaty ending their conflict with the U.S. But the Red Sticks, a splinter faction, began receiving British assistance once that war in Europe had come to an end. And the idea was that their assistance would allow for frontier attacks to continue. But with Jackson having superior numbers, he was able to resist many of these attacks by the British and their native allies. But he knew that the southern Mississippi River, and especially the port city of New Orleans, would likely be a major target. So after driving the British out of Pensacola, Florida in late 1814, the race was on to see who could get to the city of New Orleans first. Jackson's army of about 1,000 regulars and maybe 3,000 to 4,000 militia, pirates, and various other assorted fighters did get there first, and along with civilians and slaves, began building fortifications south of the city. On January 8, 1815, the British military attacked with 2 large main assaults on the American position, both of which were repulsed. With most of their officers dead or wounded and their position exposed by a rising sun and clearing fog, the British Army was forced to retreat. In a space of about 25 minutes, the British had had approximately 700 killed, 14 wounded, and 500 men taken prisoner, a total loss of about 2,600. American losses were only 13 killed, about 39 wounded, and maybe another 20 or so missing or taken captive. It was a decisive victory for the Americans. And I'm going to encourage you guys to pause and click the link that I'm going to put in the description box below, because I've got a song that was written and published in the middle of the 20th century, in the 1950s, became a #1 hit here in the United States, but it looks at this War of 1812, and specifically this Battle of New Orleans, as a form of popular culture. And it's actually set to a song that was written, the tune anyway, the tune was written around the time of the Battle of New Orleans, not too long afterwards, sort of as a celebratory story about the battle. And of course, it is very much an American perspective and very sort of pro-American nationalistic. So go ahead and pause this video and go click on that link and go listen to that song. It's only about 2 minutes long. Go on. All right, so I guess you're back now. Well, remember, throughout the war, support for the U.S. cause was actually fairly weak, and in some cases non-existent, especially in Federalist areas of the Northeast. Very few men volunteered to serve, and banks that were there often refused to finance the war. The Hartford Convention in 1814 was an attempt by the Federalists in New England to suggest changes to the U.S. Constitution that would remove the Southern advantage, which they actually felt was responsible for the war and the hardships that went along with it in the first place. Now, some of their proposals would have been to end the 3/5 compromise, to limit the president to just 1 term, and to require a 2/3 majority vote for any declaration of war. But some of the more radical attendees even suggested secession from the rest of the Union to form their own country. By the time the delegates arrived in Washington, D.C. with their proposed amendments and suggestions, the whole point of their meeting and their suggestions was moot, because the war was over. The negativism of the Federalists, though, helped to ruin the party's reputation, and really it only survived in a few scattered areas across the country after the war, because so many Americans believed that we had won the war because of that decisive victory at the Battle of New Orleans, regardless of what the treaty said. Speaking of the treaty, after the failure of the attack on Baltimore, peace talks began in Ghent, which is in modern Belgium, with Britain seeking an armistice, just an end to the fighting. In the negotiations, the U.S. officially gave up its demands to end impressment, while Britain promised to leave Canada's borders unchanged and abandon any sort of efforts to create an Indian state in the Northwest, essentially putting everything back to the way it was. They call that status quo antebellum. And the treaty was signed on December 24th, 1814, and would be ratified by the United States Senate the following February. Even though neither side really lost anything or gained anything, a lot still changed. The issue of impressment, though, remember this was the main reason we went to war, and the treaty doesn't mention it, it actually stopped. And that's largely because the Royal Navy no longer needed sailors for their war in Europe because the war in Europe was over. And except for occasional border disputes and the circumstances of the American Civil War, relations between the U.S. and Britain actually remained generally peaceful for the rest of the 19th century, and the two countries would become close allies into the 20th century. And even though the war was essentially a stalemate, the U.S. viewed it as a victory, and a strong sense of nationalistic pride swept the country. Now, viewing the war as a success and wanting to continue their expansion, the U.S. looked to Florida as a likely addition. During the war, the U.S. had claimed portions of West Florida, and with the Spanish fighting alongside the British against Napoleon, Americans basically viewed them as enemies. Over the years, Spanish Florida had proved to be a refuge for runaway slaves, pirates, smugglers, and Native Americans who were resisting westward expansion, often raiding frontier settlements and then retreating back across the border where Spanish authorities were basically too weak to take any sort of action when the U.S. protested. In 1818, Andrew Jackson led a U.S. army across the border, crushing the Seminole Indians and capturing 2 Spanish forts. Because of growing independence movements in Latin America and the weakness of Spain in the aftermath of the wars against Napoleon, Spain essentially felt that selling Florida to the United States was the only solution. So in 1819, they transferred Florida to the United States in the Adams-Onis Treaty, also known as the Florida Purchase Treaty, in exchange for the U.S. assuming legal claims of American citizens against Spain up to a total of $5 million. The treaty would also define the western boundary of the United States where it bordered New Spain, and Spain ceded its claims to the Oregon Territory to the United States. Now, all sections of the country actually supported this purchase, but really the South stood to benefit the most. By the end of the War of 1812, the United States had achieved dominance over the Great Lakes. But after the war, both powers were relatively wary of each other's military strength, resulting in an arms race involving the building of ships on the Great Lakes. But both countries wanted to cut their military expenses and viewed their potential trade relationship as very valuable. So they realized that in the event there was any sort of future conflict, the Great Lakes is where you were going to have likely conflict, but at the same time, it was going to be extremely difficult and extremely expensive to try and defend that area. So it was suggested that disarmament would be the right path to take, and to limit each country to just 1 or 2 ships on each of the Great Lakes. And both countries agreed to it in an agreement known as the Rush-Bagot Treaty in 1817. It also opened the door for further negotiations on disputed boundaries between the 2 nations. A year later, they signed the Treaty of 1818, which actually simplified the boundary between the United States and Canada, which was still part of the British Empire, running it along the 49th parallel all the way to the Continental Divide, because it was a heck of a lot easier to calculate where that was, as opposed to rivers which could change course with varying seasons. This gave the United States the Red River Colony, and the United States would end up giving to Canada a portion of the original Louisiana Purchase territory. They also agreed to a joint occupation of Oregon and addressed issues of fishing rights as well as compensation for runaway or captured slaves, claims that dated back all the way to the War of 1812. Well, American success in negotiating these treaties with France and Spain encouraged them to consider how to limit European influence in the rest of the Western Hemisphere. Spanish colonies in Latin America had taken advantage of the Spanish involvement in the Napoleonic Wars to begin to establish their own independence movements, and Spain's attempts to regain control were defeated. There was a rumor going around that a European alliance was planning to help Spain reconquer Latin America, which concerned the United States. Of course, they were also concerned about Russian expansion southward from Alaska into Oregon and California. In President Monroe's executive message to Congress in December of 1823, he announced what came to be known as the Monroe Doctrine, which had 4 basic ideas. First, that the Western Hemisphere would close to further European colonization. Second, that the U.S. would not interfere with the existing colonies of any European power. Third, that the U.S. would not interfere in the internal affairs of any European power. And fourth, that any attempt by European powers to intervene in the Western Hemisphere would be regarded by the U.S. as dangerous to our peace and safety. Now, the American people loved it, but really we had no way of enforcing it. But Britain agreed with the basic sentiment because they wanted to weaken their European rivals and establish trade with these new Latin American countries, so the British Navy became the true enforcement of this policy rather than anything the Americans could have done. And even though it wasn't binding on any future presidents, the Monroe Doctrine would help shape U.S. foreign policy for many years, well into the 20th century. All right, so that's a long one, but that is what you need to know about the U.S. on the world stage in the early part of the 19th century. In the next video, we're going to look at some of the economic benefits of this with increased trade and industrialization.